This is, in essence, one of the most important conversations about defections is about security defections, and that's what I wanted to focus my brief talk on. And I wanted first to give you two quotes, one from Gene Sharp from 1970s, which is focusing on the importance of looking into security defections. And he is saying that nonviolent actionists, actually through their actions, through their engagement in nonviolent resistance, they can impose such a pressure on the opponent that that its forces can actually be engaged in mutiny against their masters. And this could be via kind of disruptive nonviolent actions as well as creative nonviolent actions. So in 1973, Gene Sharp is kind of talking about the possibility of security defections from the dictatorship, right? 30, 40 years before. And now, there was a testimony after the Arab Spring happened in Congress that asked the intelligence committee asked the intelligence community, U.S. intelligence community, including people from Pentagon and CIA, why they missed Arab Spring. So the top guy came to that committee, Leo Panetta, a former CIA director and that time U.S. Secretary of Defense, trying to explain why they missed the Arab Spring. So what he says, there has always been a feeling that the military ultimately could control any demonstration in any regime. But the loyalty of the military is now something that we have to really pay attention to, because it's not always the one that will respond to what a dictator may or may not want. So it took 40 years for the US intelligence community to understand actually that military or security forces may indeed defect dictator during nonviolent conflict. Of course, it happened many times, but this is intelligence community that we have. That it takes really a couple of decades to catch up with the literature on civil resistance to understand what's going on. So that's where we are in terms of policy, and that's where we are in terms of civil resistance practice and scholarship. They are completely separate, oftentimes. So why we are looking into importance of why we think that security defections are important, and that is reinforced by studies by Erika and Maria. Of course, on one hand, that the security royalties, they determine the regime survival, and as well as movement success. And the study says that security defections occurred in 52% of the time in the successful campaigns between 1900 and 2006. So they were quite important for the eventual positive outcome of nonviolent resistance. They occurred in more than half of the times. And security defections make nonviolent campaigns 46 times more likely to succeed than nonviolent campaigns where defections didn't occur. Now, one thing is that sometimes in nonviolent resistance you've got different types of defections, not necessarily from security forces. I would argue that Solidarity movement in Poland was successful not because security defected from the communist regime, but because bureaucracy and business actually defected from and administration, civil servants defected from the communist regime. So you may have situations where actually different groups, not necessarily security forces, would defect, and that would still determine a positive outcome for the movement. But for this conversation, I will just focus again on the security pillar and security forces. Now, when the civil resistors are trying to understand how they might be more effective in eroding loyalties of the security forces, the first recognition that I think they need to make is that security forces are non-monolith. And on a basic level, if you were to engage in kind of mapping of the security forces, what are the main types of security forces that we have in a country that the state would have? Okay, army, police, military, police, and what? And intelligence, right? So exactly. So yeah, I mean, I know that I'm in front of the activists here, or people who are thinking like activists. So those three groups, on a very basic level, So again, that's indication that there are different types of security forces. But what is important for our analysis that they are not monolithic is that what are their functions? And of course, the army is there to defend the territory against the foreign threats. The police is there to go after criminals and fight with crime, domestic crime. And interior security would be involved in the kind of intelligence gathering internally. And usually the dictators would rely on interior security forces, would rely on the police if needed, but oftentimes they would have loyal Praetorian Guard within the interior security forces. And usually they would ask the military to come and intervene as a last resort, where they no longer can rely on the police or interior security forces. Now, when they ask the military to engage in suppression of the resistance, this goes against the mission of the military. And oftentimes you've got the questions coming from the military officers, we are not here to kill our own people, we are here to kill the enemy soldiers. What is then the mission that you are giving us? And actually that happened during the Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine, when Yanukovych tried to mobilize 4 army brigades and turn them into interior security forces. He needed more interior security forces, troops, to deal with Euromaidan. And he couldn't collect those soldiers from Berkut police and from other police forces, some of them already defected. So he asked the army to become interior security forces. All 4 divisions or brigades that he asked to come as interior security forces, they refused to do that. They said, this is not our mission. And oftentimes, when one, as an activist, is trying to analyze those different groups, there might be different questions to ask to help strategize how to reach out to those groups. So what is the ethos and interest of each of that group? What is the mission of that group? Whether there are certain animosities between military or the police or interior security forces. And in the Egyptian case, for example, there were certain animosities between the police and the army that could have been explored and were exploited. What is the autonomy in terms of decision-making within each group? How autonomous or independent they might be vis-a-vis the political masters, and also how the obedience and cooperation of these groups is maintained, whether through scare tactics or through awards, and then that may determine certain actions of the activists in the movement. And each of that relatively, or something that might be seen as monolithic, each of that group is also divided. Within the army, you've got conscripts, of course, officers, mid-level officers, generals, and with each of them would have different interests and preferences that could be exploited. We talked briefly about social distance. That's another kind of component in terms of strategizing to induce or increase the chances for security defections. This comes from the occupation of German Ruhr after the First World War. The French army occupied the German Ruhr to get reparation from the First World War, and this kind of social distance was also seen as an element that undermined that occupation. Essentially, like in the case of Czechoslovakia that Stephen was talking about, similarly, the Frenchmen presented themselves as a polite people that were unjustly, the German population of the German Ruhr presented themselves as a polite people that were unjustly occupied by the French. And they reached out to the French soldiers. As a result, the French government had to increase the rotation of the troops. That increased also the cost of the occupation and affected the French budget, increasing the budget deficit that time, and eventually forcing the French to withdraw from the German Ruhr. Now, when we think about the loyalty shifts, there are different or gradation of the loyalty shifts that we can think about. This division comes from is informed by the study done by Annika Benedijk in her PhD thesis here at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where she looked, her main case study was Ukraine 2004, and she differentiated different levels of loyalty shifts or defections. And then for the movement, the strategy is which kind of level of defections the activists are interested in. And on a basic level, you may have like kind of anti-system defections, which on a more extreme level are resulting in refusal to follow the orders, or follow those orders unprofessionally. You may imagine, for example, a case where the superior is calling police chief at the police station and asking that police chief to mobilize its units and go to the streets and essentially clear the streets. And after 2 hours, nothing happens, and he calls him back and says, "What's going on? Why you are not with your people, with your team, clearing the streets?" And the guy answers, "Well, actually, we are still looking for that live ammunition. We cannot really find it." Now, if you are a superior of that person, calling from the capital, he is somewhere in the province, you really don't know whether he's saying truth or not. Actually, he may say the truth because there is so much inefficiency in our police system that he may indeed still look for this live ammunition. Or he may not. Who knows? And actually, probably the most difficult defection to repress, it's defection based on inefficiency. Because you don't know really whether this is done on purpose or indeed it's part of the system that is kind of ineffective. And then another level of defections will be more kind of pro-movement defections, which would require much more than staying within the system. It would require to leave the system, either share information secretly or openly with the movement about, for example, police or troops deployments in certain cities and how the activists should plan, or joining the movement. And you had that examples during the Tahrir revolution, where soldiers would come. There were like 6 or 7 soldiers that in one moment they came out on the stage and they kind of spoke openly about joining Tahrir revolution. And then you've got, I would say, ultimate level of defection when the defectors would say, "We'll protect the movement." And that was the case in 2004 during Orange Revolution. The interior security forces were still loyal to the regime and willing to implement the orders to shoot protesters. And generals in the army defected, and they said, "We will not allow that to happen, and we will protect the protesters." But in contrast to what happened in Syria, that they promised to protect protesters using arms, in Ukrainian case, they said, "What we will do, we'll create a cordon of our army troops that would be protecting people without arms and try to shoot at us." It was much more powerful, this kind of threat, in terms of stopping the interior security forces to try to push their way towards Maidan, than any threat of using violence. Shooting at unarmed troops, particularly if that army has certain prestige in the society and certain degree of support, would be unacceptable to ordinary people. So actually having army that is unarmed protecting protesters, as in Ukrainian case, it had tremendous impact on the behavior of the general responsible for interior security forces that eventually didn't dare to enter Kiev under that threat of the army protecting the the protesters. Yes?
Yes, sir. Because this is a very hypothetical and theoretical question. Are the police allowed to go on strikes, and has that ever happened in the past? And I mean, I'm just assuming they're civilian forces. Maybe the army no, but like the police is a civilian force. Can they go on strike?
I think it varies from. I mean, in legal terms, it varies probably from country to country. But in Poland, for example, under communists, they not only they couldn't go on strikes, but once Polish Solidarity trade unions was legalized, they couldn't join a legal trade union. They couldn't have even trade unions. I mean, that was under communism in Poland. Now, they right now would have in Poland the right to form trade unions, but in terms of the strikes, I think as long as that would not jeopardize safety and security of the citizens, they can engage in that. in that kind of actions. But this is in democratic content.
Also, it's a militarized police or a civil, because there are militarized polices like Carabinieri or Gendarmerie in France, Carabinieri in Italy. They cannot join unions. Civilian police can.
Mm-hmm.
Like in our case, they are classified as essential services together with nursing and fire brigade. So as per the constitution, they don't go on strike.
Right, right.
Yeah, this is Namibia.
In Tunisia, they organize in unions and they have a syndicat and they have a spokesperson and they go on strike.
That's great. That's great. That's something that actually the movement can explore. How active, in non-violent way, the police or the army is.
Actually, it's something we're happy sometimes about and not happy.
Right. So I wanted to ask you the question of how regime maintains loyalty of its security forces in the event of non-violent challenge. If we can briefly brainstorm about that, and then I will give you a couple of examples. So, what are the ways for the regime to maintain the loyalty of its security forces when they are challenged via non-violent movement? Yeah, Harun.
Actually, one of the very effective ways, as mostly in the regime that previously we had in Afghanistan, they picked up the high generals or the generals that were mostly leading the overall forces leadership from their own very credible sources, from very trusty generals that they are highly connected
Mm-hmm.
with the leadership of the country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Mabel?
By appealing to national security and obligatory loyalty to the regime. By
Okay.
appealing to reasons of national security.
Right, stability, national security. Okay, Malhel?
In case of Syria, like for decades, the regime puts the leadership in hands of the minority where the president comes from. So Alawites hold these leadership positions inside security forces and the army. So he kept the loyalty.
So the strategy would be to build sectarian army, so it would be more kind of loyal. Anna?
Well, I don't know if it has happened, but I would assume they could just boost the budget of that for, increase the salaries and stuff like that, which is very direct incentive,
Right.
and demonize the movement.
Right, so brand them terrorists and then give the police more kind of money. Okay, let's go. Income? Cameroon.
Yes, in Cameroon we have the same situation as in Syria. You have the army is controlled by the direct tribes of the head of state. Then you have also the control by means. Financially, they have the big salaries, but also it is controlled by his close friend with whom he moves. Because we have a head of state who is there for 30 years. So he has his friends, he has his promotioners with whom he runs the army. Yes.
Okay.
And he has a strong control on the army, really strong control on the army.
Okay. One more maybe voice and we'll move forward. There will be a couple of, I already, let's give a voice to that side. Alejandro and Moses.
Okay, so I think another way of doing it is by raising the stakes of some key people in the security forces. For example, I mean, in Venezuela, I think in other places, you provide positions, like you make army people or police people governors or ministers, so somehow you decentralize the stakes, so there's more.
You give them perks.
more support
Okay.
there.
Mm-hmm. And Moses?
Well, close to that, but like in our situation, the regime also recruits informal intelligence, who may be junior, but they give information direct to the leadership. They can even threaten the position of higher military or intelligence leaders.
Right.
So that also makes either you are loyal to the government or you...
Right. Yeah, I will move forward. There would be more questions actually, guys, to respond.
Just to add to
Yeah.
this, Tunisia is a police state, so that's the best example.
Yeah.
When you have even university police, which is standing in front of the university, observing what's going on with the students' movements and everything. And sometimes it's not about money, but it's about privilege. So they're not well paid, but they have privilege in society that are well equipped. In comparison to the army, is not well equipped, but they receive salaries.
Hmm.
And that appeared after the revolution because
Right.
you have very poor army with no equipment, and then you
Right.
have strong police.
So it comes, but still comes down to certain material benefits, whether it's good weapons that can shoot still, and or more money that you get into the pocket.
And one more thing, not Benali, but the Bourguiba use is to have orphans becoming police. And so regime becomes God or father.
Right. So there's more kind of ideological training. Yes. So that might be going into the special ideological and psychological training that they would receive. And if you have already underprivileged young people joining or drafted to the army or the police, that make them more kind of a good material to brainwash, essentially. So demonizing the protesters. It actually happened in Ukraine. Before the police was released on the protesters, they were actually held in the police cars for a number of hours. They were not allowed to go to the toilet. They were not allowed to kind of do much, and they would need to stay in one place. And they were told that you are here, you are suffering this physical discomfort because those guys are protesting. So once they released them after 10 hours of holding them in those cars, of course the aggression was there against the protesters. And that happened on November 30th, 2013, when they went after 300 or so unarmed students. Stephen mentioned that there is this deployment outside of the hometowns because there is this fear that they would have certain relations and associations with the people they live in. Now, other tactics, sometimes the army, and that happened in Syria, they would be accompanied by the feared security service officers, and they might be actually killed. So security service would be behind them, and they would shoot in the back if they would refuse to carry the orders. That also happened in Syria. Some of the army units were not trusted enough, so they were given less ammunition. And then, of course, higher bonuses during revolutions. And there was a joke among the Egyptian police saying that it's probably we are the only group that is benefiting handsomely when there is a revolution. It's interesting, it's ironic, that the police might be actually interested in having a revolution that they can kind of control, because then their salaries would be increased. So now another question, how movement can encourage security forces to shift their loyalties, and how movement can entice security forces to be less violent or non-violent? So a couple of ideas, and we don't have much time. Again, the boat cruise is waiting for us. So just 2 or 3 ideas, and then, yes, Daniel.
In Venezuela, in street protests, it's worked to tell the military officers directly, like address them directly as one of the people. Your sister could be here, your mother could be here, we can be your children. That
Exactly.
kind of message.
Yeah, good. Andrei?
2 cases from Ukraine. One is the brilliant tactics of placing mirrors in front of the police, because usually we don't see ourselves in this uniform and this scary helmets and everything, and how we look like. That's one part of it. Also, bringing a lot of tea, bread with butter, and
Right. Yeah.
beautiful girls.
I have 1 or 2 pictures to illustrate that. And Hamza.
I just want to say, in 2012, the Moldovan government was overthrown by police who went on strike. They refused to work and they joined the protesters, and it was propaganda by the protesters, propaganda which wasn't even true, but the police believed it, and they actually went on strike, and that was the main reason the government was overthrown. Maldives?
So, no intention to harm, and you will have that presentation uploaded. You can watch that YouTube. It's from 2010 protests in Egypt, and actually already in 2010, that was I think around spring, how the protesters were trying to keep nonviolent discipline, so the protesters would not engage physically with the police, and they would also engage in conversations about what would you do if your mother was here, and would you use violence and so on. So it's an interesting short video, only 2 minutes. This is Hack the Police protest in Chile during the strikes to introduce reforms of the higher education, giving the flowers during the Orange Revolution. This is the examples from Euromaidan, the revolution in Ukraine. You've got those girls whose purpose, actually the strategy was to reach out to the police. And with the campaign, Love Us, Not Beat Us. And they would bring flowers. Some would, pray in front of the soldiers. Some would bring the chocolate for the soldiers. For the police. The tea, hot tea, was distributed to the police, and some flowers. Again, to reduce the aggressiveness of the police, and that's what Andrei mentioned in terms of shaming, bringing the mirrors in front of the police, so they would look at each other. They would look at who they are. Some of the police kind of bend their heads, not wanting to see themselves, and also protest by disabled people. So will you shoot us as well? That was after the police used violence against the protesters, and then you've got, like we say that that anyone can join nonviolent movement, whether rich, poor, whether healthy or less healthy. This is an example of the people that are disabled joining protests.
A very quick example in Egypt, I saw a video that was fantastic. There were some protesters who were singing songs just face to face with the police and using their helmets to do this.
Drums.
Yeah, and they couldn't help but laughing and sympathizing with this gesture.
Yeah, if it's a good song. So in one moment I saw this picture. So this was a complete commitment for the struggle. Right?
I want to make a comment.
Sure.
Because these strategies that you're mentioning, of course, they're a bit sexist. They're quite sexist, honestly. They're not a bit. And I don't think they were. These are good to appeal to an audience, and we're like really cheering and stuff like that. But these are not the only ones. These are the sexy ones that are circulated in Facebook and stuff like that.
Right.
One thing that I want to raise is that these same strategies are used by the police themselves. The police can oftentimes bring like food to the protesters and have some things like that actually force you to go to the toilet all the time. And when you build this rapport between each other, then you don't realize at one point who actually lets the other down. So we should be aware of all these tactics that, or for example, giving flowers. I remember very well the one day when it was March 8th, which is another problem why on March 8th women are given flowers, not right. But on March 8th, in a particular instance of protest, the police would bring flowers to the protesting women. And then sort of in the end it goes like, we're asking you for a favor, would you just remove this place from. So, I don't know, some of these are, you should treat them with reservation. You should treat them also.
And I want to say that I'm not selective, because this is just, if we had more time, I've got more examples that are not involving necessarily, on the forefront of the resistance women, but I cannot ignore them because they happened. It's not that I'm inventing them in terms of, and again, this comes from the country where that has tradition of women being at the forefront of resistance and reducing the tensions. If that happened, in some of the African countries, like in Zimbabwe, women would be beaten up immediately. So that depends on the context and culture. So you point to the very important thing. But again, that happens. So that cannot be ignored. That's the tactics that are used in terms of appealing to the police. But let me show you a couple of other examples to balance these strategies used by nonviolent movements. So another strategy that was also used during the Euromaidan was to set up as a big stage and screen and project that screen towards the police with the news that won't be censored. So they would watch this. I mean, they weren't too far from the barricades of the protesters. So they put that in front of the barricades so the police could watch the kind of uncensored news. Some other things. Oftentimes, protesters would approach retired officers and veterans from the army and the police to appeal to the serving colleagues And oftentimes those retired police would have already different preferences and interests by the time they leave the service. So they oftentimes would be more inclined to actually support the protesters' message, particularly if that message is shared by many. Some of them, family members of the security forces, they do participate in those movements and protesters. And that's a major concern. Heard the stories also from the police in Ukraine coming, saying that we will not use violence. I will not use violence because my father, not my child, but actually my father is among the protesters. And then also the activists, when they are reaching to the security forces, they would ask, who do you serve, the country or the person that is currently in power? So where is this honor and professional ethos? And the movement that is able to show that they are representing grievances of the whole society, it's probably much more effective in trying then to reach out to the security forces, because those grievances might also apply to those conscripts, to the police, that would not have certain economic or social political grievances. Some of the movements would actually use international norms and appeal and bring the human rights norms to the conversation and to the outreach to the police in terms of how the police should behave and act vis-a-vis nonviolent movements. And as Stephen said, some of the movements would offer protection for the mutinous army. And again, the kind of highlighting also the bad situation that the troops are in terms of economic and social situation. All right, sometimes it's enough if you suggest to the police officers that they should ask for written orders before they implement the orders they are given. Oftentimes, or more often than not, dictators would not like that to be on record, that they are asking the soldiers or police to shoot at the protesters. Such a simple thing like ask for written orders before you implement that may change the whole dynamic of the conflict. In one case, before the army was deployed, the heads of the army asked the Supreme Court to rule whether it's constitutional to ask the army to go against the people. Before the verdict was given, the dictator was gone, and that was actually the situation in the Philippines in 1986. Sometimes during the negotiations with the army, the activists can give a solution. If the army is to retake, and that comes as an example from Serbia, if the army was sent to recapture a factory that is on strike, the workers engaged in negotiations with this army and said, how about we leave through the main gate and you report on that means that the boat is already leaving, guys. So, so they actually reported to this capital that the workers left through the main gates. We resolved the strike, but the workers returned in the night and to continue the strike. So that was the kind of conversation they had with the police. And okay, let me skip the international. I will just show you this book that came out and finish here. It's the publication done by Admiral and the former head of the National Security Council, I don't recall it, Director of National Intelligence, Dennis Blair, who wrote an interesting study on military engagement, where he, in essence, says that the mission of the armies of democracies should be not only to fight the wars, but to promote democratic principles and practices, particularly during the interactions with the armies from non-democracies. There is a lot of trainings going on in United States where there are officers and coming from countries that would have certain, that would not be fully democratic, and they engage with the kind of professionalization training with the US Army. And he argues that this is the point where the US Army could actually contribute to professionalization and building kind of public and professional ethos of those armies. So then when they are asked by the dictators to shoot at armed protesters, they might be more likely to question those orders. So this is, I think, an interesting and important publication that I will ask you to look at. I think 1 or 2 chapters are in the e-classroom. Yes?
I think it is also a kind of indirect form of the democratic peace theory of Joseph
another country or another forces can go there, invade it, bring democracy. But this is the indirect form. I mean, they can bring there, train them, and tell them how to democratize the country. But in democratic peace theory, Joseph Nye says that a democratic state can invade a non-democratic state to bring democratization.
Doesn't work.
All right. I wish we could entertain, more questions, but it's right. I'm really 10 minutes beyond my time. You can access. There are more slides here and more information. You will be able to access those slides on eClassroom. But I need to kind of finish this. And thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, for presenting with me.